Everyone says measuring behavior change is hard. It's not hard. We've done it on over 9,000 programs. What is hard is doing it in one shot, and what's near impossible is doing it after the fact. And if you find it challenging, it's not your fault. We weren't taught to focus on what happens after the session. We were taught to focus on what happens in the room. So today I want to walk you through our approach for measuring behavior change in a way that's clear, easy, and demonstrable for your clients. And it starts with what happens in the room. When you've got people all excited and inspired, that's when we want to capture their intention towards behavior change. A single behavior change. That's the core for us, is we want to pick one thing that they're going to focus on changing over the coming weeks. Can they do more? Of course they can. But we want to focus on one because that becomes the baseline for our measurement. Then we want to make sure that they are actually tracking that behavior change, that they're checking in on their progress. We do this with a two-part check-in prompt. It's a 1 to 10 Likert scale. How do they feel they're doing on that behavior change? And an opportunity to journal, basically to explain in a couple seconds why they gave themselves that rating. This takes 10, 15 seconds. We aim for a couple times a week. And in fact, if you want stats on what good looks like, inside Actionable across 9,000 programs, a little over 100,000 participants, we see 78% of participants making commitments to a change publicly, declaring it, logging it in a system, and that they interact with the platform. In other words, they are recording their progress 8.2 times per month. So what we end up with is a fairly robust self-reported behavior change data set. But self-reported only gets us so far. And most of your clients will go, yeah, but it's self-reported. And so we want to insert an observed behavior change window. This is where the participants' colleagues will reflect on their progress. Again, a simple 1 to 10 scale. How strongly do you see this change taking place for the participant? Now, here's where things get interesting. Across our entire data set, we see a 93% correlation between the self-reported behavior change rating and the observed behavior change rating. 93%, which would strongly suggest that most people are not out of touch as some external pundits might think. People are pretty good at acknowledging where they are gaining traction and where they're falling down. And in fact, we find that the 7% differential tends to skew lower for the participant, meaning they are actually harder on themselves than their colleagues are. So what have we accomplished here? What we've done is we've captured self-reported behavior change data and we've correlated it with observed behavior change data. Now, this in and of itself does not speak to business impact, but it does provide a very compelling story for the fact that, yes, in fact, change has happened. So what? Does an executive team look at this and care? Well, maybe, but it depends on how well they understand that these behaviors are in alignment with the strategic priorities of the organization. When we can bridge that gap, show the behaviors that are linked to strategic priorities are changing and growing, then we start to get traction. And then when we take the final step of organizing the data, not through the lens of cohorts or participants, but instead through business units, seniority, function, geography, then we start to tell a very rich and compelling impact story. I go into that bridge in more detail, both in a 32-page report that walks through all of it, and also a couple other videos on YouTube. So for this one, I'll encourage you to post the word report down below, and I will send you the full 32-page report if you want. Otherwise, you can head over to YouTube, look for Actionable Chris, and find the longer format videos there.